Welcome back to another episode of Small Battalion. I'm Sandra Battaglini, your host. This episode, we're going to discuss the FAANGs and their threat to Canada's cultural sovereignty and that of other nations. What is a FAANGs? Fang, F-A-A-N-G. It doesn't refer to the long pointed tooth invertebrate animals or similarly in spiders used to seize prey and sometimes inject venom, although the definitions are the same.
One of the most common questions I get from people who find out that I keep tarantulas is, aren't they poisonous? So the correct answer to that question is no. Tarantulas are not poisonous, but they are venomous. And there is a difference between poisonous and venomous. And now both venom and poison have toxins. Toxins are what wreak havoc on our bodies. Now the difference between venom and poison is how it is delivered to the victim. Venom is injected and poison is ingested.
The FAANGs I'm talking about is an acronym for Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. We can all agree that they are masters of seizing prey and injecting venom. I first learned of the term when I read this book, The Tangled Garden, a Canadian cultural manifesto for the digital age. I know, look at me killing it on obscure Canadian books. What are you doing with your time? And it's written by Richard Sturzberg. Sturzberg served as Assistant Deputy Minister of Culture and Broadcasting in the federal government. He was the Executive Director of Telefilm Canada and Head of English Language Services at the CBC. In his introduction, he accurately asserts, living next to the United States, the wealthiest and most dynamic country of the last 100 years, English Canada has always found it difficult to carve out a space for its own distinctive culture. It has been continually swamped by American news, TV, films, books, and magazines, along with the values, hopes, and dreams that they embody. No other country has lived in such close proximity to so powerful and overwhelming a neighbor with whom it shares both language and a commitment to freedom of expression. Although, right now, that's not happening. The fear of being assimilated into the United States runs through the history of Canada's cultural, artistic, and political life. The American embrace, both desired and reviled, is the fundamental existential threat. English Canada lives with the apprehension that it could vanish as a separate place, no more distinct than Ohio or Minnesota, swallowed up in the all-consuming pressure of manifest destiny. That sums us up pretty nice, wouldn't you say? In 2010, when the FAANGs began to emerge in Canada, it would be a sort of death knell to the Canadian media business. Before the appearance of these beasts, Canadian companies spent their advertising dollars on Canadian magazines, newspapers, television networks, but now they increasingly favored Facebook and Google, with their money no longer staying in Canada and instead flowing into Silicon Valley. I hate Facebook so much. Every time I post on Facebook, I feel like I'm yelling into an abandoned Walmart. I mean, it's the same colors. It looks like the same brand, right? Facebook is basically obituaries, new babies, cancer diagnoses, and fights. I stupidly posted a piece on Facebook about the virus and immediately told I was wrong. It was wrong. That it was counterproductive. That poor me. I don't know what I'm talking about. Well, thank you, boys on the internet, for rushing to condemn my intelligence and frame me for not knowing or being gullible. So I make this post, right? And really shortly thereafter, the video I posted is 2 hours long. This person comments with a post from PubMed condemning the folks that I had posted. And I responded, well, I guess the point is everyone's got a point. And he replied, but some are competent. I think a good analogy is comedy. Lots of people think they're funny, but you're a pro. You can tell if someone has the goods moments after they step on stage. The link you posted are like a group of amateur comedians with amazing production values. The rebuttal is coming from the pros. I wouldn't comment if I didn't think such info was counterproductive. Thank you so much for the explanation. I mean, what would I do without it? But at the same time, why the fuck did I bother? When Netflix and Amazon entered the Canadian market, There was no regulatory framework in place, so they came in guns a-blazing. That's really how America always shows up, with their guns out of their holsters, shooting up a fucking storm. And because of this mutiny, the CRTC just underwent a major telecommunications and broadcast review, with new legislation being tabled shortly, or so they say. The rules hadn't been updated since the 70s, so there was no rules in place for the internet, which is, seems very Canadian.
Just about everything on Canadian TV and radio, from advertising time to Canadian content, is regulated by the CRTC.
This was David Milgaard's day.
But when TV and radio stations, or anyone else, transmit video or audio signals over the World Wide Web and onto computer screens, the CRTC hasn't been involved.
She'll be able to be happy and to heal.
Now, after almost a year of considering whether it should, the broadcast regulator has decided it's hands off the internet.
The Commission does not believe that regulation of the new media would further the objectives of the Broadcasting Act. There is a substantial Canadian presence on the internet today.
CRTC officials say there are already laws to deal with illegal or offensive material on the internet, and the industry has proven to be self-regulating.
I think there will be standards on the internet, but the industry itself has been setting the standards and policing it, and almost every day we're seeing about more activity that's taking place in this area.
The people who provide internet service to Canadians question whether the CRTC would even be capable of regulating the internet if it wanted to.
Don't see how they could have done it. The internet is an international phenomenon.
With the CRTC deciding not to regulate the internet, many traditional broadcasters in Canada are asking whether they should continue to face regulations themselves.
If we're going to have the internet and the broadcasting system, one regulated, one not regulated, one with enormous costs, the other not, then that's not fair, and you have to change that.
The CRTC says, if necessary, it can change that. While it has closed the door on regulating the internet, it can always ease regulations for the traditional broadcasters, so that if they find themselves facing direct competition from the internet, it will be on a more level playing field.
I love bureaucrats, okay? You guys spent a year studying something, and at the end, your solution was, we ain't gonna do nothing. I mean, is that not classic Gov? Right? How about, Gov, you pay us that money back that you spent on that year where you came up with nothing, instead of asking us to pay you back CERB, okay? Because right now, artists are being asked to pay back CERB. Right now, I'm not even getting CERB or CRB, whatever the new name is, okay? I'm not even getting the new named income because they said I needed to prove my income, all right? That I haven't filed my 2019 taxes because my accountant is inundated. I've called him, but he's not answering, all right? And so I then called him up and I was like, what am I going to do? I'm not making any money. I don't have any money. Anyways, I realized, oh yeah, I got a couple things I could send, okay? So I go on their online system, I submit, I keep getting an error message over and over and over again. I call up CRA and they're like, oh, we'll send you to our e-services. 2-hour wait. I'm like, I'm going to shoot somebody now, okay? So anyways, I call back. They're like, well, if that doesn't work, fax us. I'm like, pardon? Fax? What? I had to literally walk all the way down Queen Street into the beach before I found a motherfucking fax that I could use. There was a couple places that had a fax, but nobody wanted to touch my paper because of COVID. Are we losing it? Oh my God. Anyways, fax them the information. Then I follow up and they're like, we got your stuff, but it's going to take 4 to 6 weeks. By that time, I'm going to be eating my own flesh. I also love how naive they were about the internet, right? That they didn't need to create rules around it. It's beautiful. So when they come into our market, there's no rules. There's no method to collect or pay tax. And they didn't have to create Canadian content. According to Stursberg, this had such a negative impact on the newspaper industry, bureaus were closing around the country and journalists let go. CTV Global and City TV were crashing by 2012. They were the powerhouses of the private news business and the biggest commissioners of Canadian drama and comedy. And while all of this was going on, Stephen Harper and the Conservative government paid no heed. Instead of helping the Canadian media business, Stephen Harper went out of his way to help the FAANG. And Sturberg calls this the hollowing out of the Canadian cultural ecosystem. Then the Liberals come into power in 2015 and they were like, hey, we're going to fix this. But in their first term, they became paralyzed and did nothing. Just to highlight my point, on February 9th of 2021, Bell announced they would be cutting all sports radio formats, and that in Vancouver and Winnipeg, those channels would convert to a funny format, replicating what they're doing in Hamilton on Funny 820. Now, if you listen to Funny 820, you'll see that they play mostly American comedians. I'm told that Canadian comedians do get played, but if you go to their website, it doesn't look like it. Let's check it out. Okay. We've got those dad guys. I don't know who they are. We got the Shooms, Trevor Noah, Bill Burr, Weird Al Yankovic. Yeah, Weird Al is our guy. Even disgraced comedian Chris D'Elia gets a photo up alongside quasi-disgraced comedian Ellen DeGeneres. I mean, when are we going to start advertising Canadian comedians? So I was curious. And I went to the iHeart people, Funny 820, and I was like, how can we get Canadian comedians playing on this station? And there's a guy in Texas. The person who programs the channel is in the United States. The person who programs the Canadian channel is in the United States. And you won't get paid. So the Canadian comedians who do get played do not get paid. What a love story. Honest to God. You know, when are we going to start to pay and play Canadian comedians? Okay, there's a few places they're being played, but it's so small. All right. Like, world, if you're listening, you wonder what's happening in Canada. I know. Shit, man. Especially now, nada. Now that you have 3 funny format radio stations, I hope you are supposed to be following Canadian content rules, which means you need to be playing 30% Canadian content and pay the motherfucking comedians. So comedians, if you're out there, email Bell, phone them, get on this station and demand to be paid. So they're closing in. We're running out of time. This in the midst of BCE's announcement that quarterly profits rose to $889 million in the fourth quarter of 2020, up from $672 million the year before. With a dividend hike to shareholders of 5%. And a wage subsidy bailout of $122 million from the government. I'm going to puke. Is it a coincidence that I'm doing this at this time? So, back to Sturberg. The Fangs not only undermined Canadian media, they also brought with them a host of corrosive cultural influences. Fake news and hoaxes began crowding out true news. Facebook was weaponized to exacerbate ethnic tensions and filter bubbles. Canadian children were increasingly subjected to online bullying and harassment. Privacy was constantly breached, and Canadians' personal data were shared with unethical marketers and political manipulators. Doesn't that sum up the last 5 years perfectly? I mean, and guys, just let's think about it. It's only been 5 years, and our heads are full. We're losing our minds. The Fangs are not only a problem in Canada, their behavior has been much focus of debate and investigation, most recently in Europe, the United States, and around the world. Now you're like, United States, isn't that where the Fangs are from? Yeah, they are. But that's the irony that the country, the government, is worried about the behavior of corporations within their borders because of deregulation. This, over the last, since Reagan, this constant process of deregulation has created this vile environment. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, an intergovernmental organization of 37 largely high-income countries, proposed a shakeup of the global corporate tax regime in 2019, with a view to make tech giants pay more taxes in countries where internet users bring them significant revenue. That sounds promising, doesn't it? But nothing really has yet materialized. And the United States isn't happy about it. They claim that digital taxes in the UK, Spain, and Austria discriminate against US companies, opening the door to new transatlantic tariffs on European goods as President-elect Joe Biden's administration enters the White House. So it's not only a Canadian problem, it's a global issue We just have the unfortunate position of being next door or upstairs, however you look at it. Since the 1930s, Canada has attempted to create a Canadian media, often in opposition to the United States. Strasbourg affirms the radio content quotas of the 1960s and 70s didn't create the music industry. What it did was show the world the breadth of Canadian talent. Artists like Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young and the band, Alanis Morissette, the Tragically Hip, Justin Bieber, Drake, Arcade Fire. Oh, come on. Same thing happened in literature. When the Canada Council for the Arts began supporting literature, brilliant writers like Mordecai Richler, Margaret Atwood, Michael Ondaatje, Alice Munro emerged. And we are so grateful. Strasbourg contends a real country, any real country, has stories, people, food, historical events, and songs that are the touch points of its understanding of itself. I always say that historians cover our history brilliantly. There are major gaps for sure. But when you consider the breadth of stories that have woven through these lands, and I mean from the beginning, it's crucial to have a place to share them. Just read an issue of the Canadian Historical Review, the Ontario History Journal, Ontario History, Manitoba History, British Columbia History Magazine, Acadiensis, Saskatchewan History Magazine, and on and on. Strasbourg concludes, cultures like life itself are continuously growing into the common dreams of the present and the shared hopes of the future. The soil in which they grow is the media. The books, films, songs, magazines, newscasts, and TV shows make it all visible and accessible. It is through the mass media that the bonds of inside jokes, repeated stories, and ubiquitous ideas are built. It is through them that national cultures are forged and a people's sense of itself is formed. And that, my folks, brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Small Battalion, The Fangs. Read about it. Get off of Facebook. We need to get off. I'm not even off of it yet. I'm prepping. But we got to get off the shit. I'm Sandra Battaglini. Take it easy. Have a good night.